Hi, everybody. This is Pastor John from the Third Presbyterian Church. We're right next door to Enos Park in the Springfield area. This is week 3 of our Bible study, Amazing Wisdom, Amazing Women. Today we're going to look at Rachel. Now, in order to look totally at Rachel, we have to look at all of the other characters that are involved in this particular story. So here's kind of a chart, a graphic that shows the different individuals. So we're going to be talking about Rachel this week, but Rachel has a sister named Leah. And Rachel and Leah are both the daughters of a guy named Laban. Now, Laban happens to be the brother of Jacob's mother. So that means that they are also Jacob's cousins. And of course, Jacob, as you remember, has a brother named Esau. And so Jacob and Esau are brothers. Rachel and Leah are sisters. Now, Leah becomes the first wife for Jacob, and Rachel becomes the second wife for Jacob. But we're going to look at Rachel's story first. Then next week, we'll look at the story of Leah. It's often been said that this is a wonderful Old Testament story of love at first sight, deception and backstabbing for many, jealousy between siblings, fighting within a marriage. In other words, just your average family story. So let's look at this graph again to show these relationships. So Jacob and Esau are constantly battling each other. Remember, Esau was the firstborn, Jacob was the secondborn. They are constantly at each other's throat, and primarily because Jacob is a conniving sort of person who's trying to steal the birthright away from Esau. So you remember Esau's out hunting, and he comes in hungry, and Jacob convinces him to give up his inheritance for a pot of stew. And then when their father, Isaac, is near his deathbed and pretty much blind, Jacob approaches him with extra hair on his arms to make him think that he's Esau so that he can then give the birthright to Jacob, thinking that he's giving it to Esau. Eventually, that blows up, and Esau makes it publicly known that he's going to go about killing his brother. At that, Jacob's mother decides that Jacob ought to flee, and so she suggests that he go live with her brother, which is his uncle Laban. And as he goes to visit his uncle Laban, he first encounters Rachel, and he immediately falls in love with her, and she immediately falls in love with him. But as the story develops, he goes to live with Uncle Laban, and he shares with Laban that he's in love with Rachel, and so he'd like to have Rachel's hand in marriage. Well, Laban agrees, but tells Jacob that he has to work 7 years in order to be able to get Rachel as his wife. Jacob agrees to do that. So for 7 years, he works for his uncle Laban. The day comes for the wedding to take place. Now, back in those days, the bride was completely veiled, covered, so you could not see her face. And so the wedding ceremony takes place, and they're in the tent on their honeymoon night, and suddenly Jacob discovers that he's not married Rachel, but instead Laban did the old switcheroo, and he's married Leah. And the reason why Laban wanted to do that was because Leah was the older sister. And according to the tradition, younger sisters should not marry until the older sisters are married. And so Laban is simply following tradition, but he's doing the switcheroo. Well, Jacob goes back to Laban and says, "What's going on here? You tricked me. I really want to marry Rachel. What do I need to do?" So Laban says, "Well, you have to work for another 7 years, and then I'll let you marry Rachel." So the ability to marry Rachel really takes 14 years of Jacob's life. Now let's read from the New International Version of Genesis 29:10 through 12 kind of reiterating the story that I just told. When Jacob saw Rachel, daughter of his uncle Laban, and Laban's sheep, he went over and rolled the stone away from the mouth of the well and watered his uncle's sheep. Then Jacob kissed Rachel and began to weep aloud. He had told Rachel that he was a relative of her father and son of Rebekah, so she ran and told her father. It's implied that Jacob immediately falls in love with her, and we find from the context there that Rachel is very much in love with Jacob. Now let's read on in 18 through 20. Jacob was in love with Rachel and said, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." Laban said, "It's better that I give her to you than to some other man. Stay here with me." So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel. But they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. But then the double-crosser, Jacob, gets double-crossed by Laban. And as I explained, in the wedding ceremony with veils completely covering the bride, he actually marries Leah instead of Rachel. Well, how do you think Rachel's feeling right now? She's been in love with Jacob ever since she saw him for the very first time. And I'm sure she was excited that he was so much in love with her that he was willing to work for 7 years to earn her hand in marriage. And then all of a sudden her father, Laban, pulls the switcheroo, and now all of a sudden the love of her life is married to someone else, and that someone else happens to be her older sister. I wonder how she felt about all of that. I wonder how she felt because of the love that she had, and the man that she was in love with was now going to be spending a marriage with her sister, which raises an interesting question. Rachel and Leah were sisters, but they wind up eventually both marrying Jacob. So are they also sisters-in-law besides being sisters? An interesting question. I'll let you decide what the answer to that one is. Now let's read what happens in this situation in Genesis 29:31. When the Lord saw that Leah was not loved because Jacob was clearly in love with Rachel, he enabled her to conceive, but Rachel remained childless. So here we have this story again of a woman who can't produce an offspring. Leah is blessed to have a child from Jacob. And of course, remembering infertility in the ancient Near East meant to the people that God must be angry or punishing you. And that begs the question, what did you do to cause God to be so angry? And what do you need to change in order to put God on your good side? And then, of course, bearing a child was the fulfillment of creative order. So Leah was doing what she was created to do, and Rachel was not able to do that. So she was less than what she was created to do. And of course, during pregnancy, a woman was put up on a pedestal and taken care of, even if they were a slave woman. And so Leah would have received special treatment from the family and from all of her maids and everyone else, and Rachel would have received nothing. Now let's look at Genesis 30:1-2. When Rachel saw that she was not bearing Jacob any children, she became jealous of her sister. So she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die." Jacob became angry with her and said, "Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children?" So here's another similar situation to Sarah and Abraham. And Sarah's not able to bear children. She's questioning the reason why. She's trying to throw blame on someone else. And in the same way, Rachel, who's now, by the way, married to Jacob after Jacob worked for 14 years to get her hand, is not able to have any children. And so she's throwing it on to Jacob, and Jacob's saying, "I'm not God. I don't control this. I can't keep you from having children." Well, then we read about Rachel hatches what most consider a familiar plan. See if you've heard this plan unfold someplace before. Then Rachel said, God has vindicated me. He has listened to my plea and given me a son. Because of this, she named him Dan. Rachel's servant Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, I have had a great struggle with my sister, and I have won. So she named him Naphtali. So Rachel's plan is to provide her maidservant, Bilhah, to sleep with Jacob, and Bilhah will have the child, but Rachel will raise the child as her own. And in her mind, she has won the battle against her sister. And Bilhah not only has one son, whom they named Dan, but they have a second son, whom she names Naphtali. Then God remembered Rachel. He listened to her and enabled her to conceive. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son and said, God has taken away my disgrace. She named him Joseph and said, may the Lord add to me another son. So her plan is to have her maidservant become pregnant and raise her children. But she's also continuing to pray to God that God might reverse the reasons why she's not getting pregnant. And lo and behold, God heard her prayers and God reversed that process and she became pregnant. Now, the son that she has is named Joseph. That's critically important because Joseph, out of all of the sons of Jacob, becomes the heir apparent to the lineage of David to eventually become the lineage of Christ. Now, Jacob has been in the land of Haran, where his uncle Laban lives, but he receives a vision from God that it's time for him to go back. So what this map shows is if you look at Beersheba, that's down about 4/5 of the way down the map, over to the left of center, Beersheba. That's the area, Hebron, Beersheba, that's the area where Abraham and Isaac lived, and that's where, of course, Jacob and Esau lived. So when he fled that area, he followed that red trek all the way up to Haran, which is where Uncle Laban lived. Well, now he's been there for about 20 years, and he's decided that it's time to go back. But he knows that Laban is just not going to let him go. And so instead of just being honest about it, the sneaky, conniving Jacob runs away in the middle of the night with Laban's daughters and all of his grandchildren. And Laban, when he wakes up that next morning, has a pursuit against Jacob. He eventually confronts Jacob, and even though he's upset and Jacob is complaining about the fact that Laban would never have let him go, finally they reconcile their differences, and Laban gets a chance to kiss his daughters and his grandchildren goodbye. And then Jacob and his family head south back to Peniel, and eventually they go over and settle in the land of Canaan. So that's what this map basically shows, and that's the journey that Jacob takes with Rachel and Leah to get back to the land that they're going to develop into what would eventually become the Promised Land. Now, Rachel's story, unfortunately, doesn't end well. As it happened often in the ancient Near East, during childbirth, Rachel began to die, and her dying wish was to name her last son Ben-Oni, which means a son of misfortune. And so she died basically in childbirth. But after her death, Jacob, once again, in his being the deceiver, changes Ben-Oni's name to Benjamin. So even in her death, Rachel doesn't seem to get her final wish. So in order for us to get all this lineage straight, I've given you this chart to take a look at. So we begin with Abraham. Remember, Abraham is married to Sarah, but she cannot conceive a son. So Sarah's plan is for Abraham to sleep with Hagar, and she becomes pregnant and has Ishmael. Eventually, Sarah becomes pregnant, and she has Isaac. Now, on this chart, who in the heck is Keturah? Well, the Bible tells us that once Sarah died, Abraham took on yet another wife by the name of Keturah, and they have some sons. Well, Isaac marries Rebekah, and they have two sons, Esau, the oldest, and Jacob, the youngest. Esau's name gets changed to Edom. Jacob's name gets changed to Israel. Remember that Esau is the firstborn, but yet he loses his inheritance and his heritage to the conniving Jacob. So then Jacob has basically 12 offspring. So there's Leah, who's the older sister, and the firstborn is Reuben, then Simeon, then Levi, then Judah, and then after that, he sleeps with Bilhah, who is the maidservant of Rachel, and has Dan and Naphtali. And then I guess Leah was tired of having children, so she offers Zilpah, her maidservant, to Jacob, and she becomes pregnant with Gad and Asher. Then Leah becomes pregnant again with Issachar and Zebulun, and then Rachel finally becomes pregnant with Joseph and, of course, Benjamin, and she dies in giving childbirth to Benjamin. Those are the 12 offspring of Jacob, and they become later on in Scripture the 12 tribes of Israel, because Jacob's name was changed to Israel, so these would be his 12 offspring, or the 12 tribes of Israel. When the Hebrew people went back into the Promised Land, they settled in the Promised Land, and the land was divided up between the 12 tribes of Israel. And so that's where this notion of the 12 tribes comes into place. Well, as we've been doing each week, I want us to think a little bit about the wisdom of the character that we're talking about. So this week, the wisdom of Rachel. First of all, she truly is a woman who is in love. She sees Jacob for the very first time. She falls in love with him. She knows how much he loves her, and she can't wait to marry him. And all she has to wait initially is 7 years. The scriptures tell us that it hardly seemed like any time at all, because Jacob was in love with her, and I'm sure she, being as much in love with him, felt like it was hardly any time at all. But then she anguishes in her love for Jacob when he's tricked into marrying Leah. But her love is strong, and she knows that ultimately God has a plan, so she continues to pray to God, and she continues to wait to see God's plan unfold. She rejoices finally in her marriage to Jacob, but after 14 years, but she's frustrated by not being able to produce an offspring. So Rachel is a person who has these great moments of joy, followed by these great moments of sadness, these highs and these lows in her life, and yet she's able to keep focused and keep her relationship close to God, because she knows God will ultimately provide a plan for her. She also becomes quite jealous of her sister, and she hatches a plan to become a surrogate mom to someone else's child, because she believes in her mind that by doing that, she then can become equal to her sister, because she's raising a child just like her sister is. And she doesn't reverse herself after the plan works. This is not like, the story is not like that of Sarah. Remember, after Hagar gave birth, Sarah suddenly turned on Hagar and Ishmael and constantly complained to Abraham. Rachel doesn't do that. She's not happy with where things are, but she doesn't reverse herself. And she continues to pray to God to bless her, and then she rejoices when God answers. And Rachel is faithful to follow Jacob When Jacob says he's received a call to go back to this new land, she, leaving her entire family and all that she's known, she's willing to go back. And in the process of giving new life, she also loses her life, which is a bit salvific, if you wish. That's what we experience in Jesus. The death of Jesus gives us eternal life. Here, Rachel gives her life in childbirth so that she can give birth to this new life. And unfortunately, the name that she picked out isn't what Jacob wants to keep as her name, and he calls him Benjamin. Well, that sums up our story on Rachel. Next week, we'll look at Leah, the other sister. Thank you so much for following along with us in this Bible study, and we'll continue to look at these women of wisdom from the Bible. And we're, as I've mentioned several times, we're doing them in pairs because oftentimes there's a connection between the two women. Everybody have a great, blessed week, and we will see you next week with next week's Bible study on Leah.